for Research and Policy Making. It's a Skopje, Macedonia-based think and do tank. I act also as a regional director of the Gender Budget Watchdog network, which operates in the Western Balkans region and the Republic of Moldova. We are a network of almost 100 CSOs that use gender-responsive budgeting tools for watchdogging governments and local governments to how they redistribute public finances. They use them and whether this correlates with different needs of women and men. Why do we focus on gender-responsive budgeting? Because we as CSOs believe that it's the most transformative policy tool, looking at the budget from a gender perspective and how the distribution of public finances is done, meeting the needs of women and men and all of their intersections. But it's for us important because also the governments internationally have committed to gender budgeting. And we are also watchdogging whether what is the progress of them meeting the international commitments that are reflected in the indicator SDG 5C1, which measures the progress of countries that make public finance for gender equality transparent and accountable. It's for us very important that we contribute to this 68th session of the Commission of the Status of Women with this topic, because it is dedicated to financing and gender budgeting, unfortunately, has been very little discussed and tackled during the program of this 68th session. In particular, our today's event is very much focused on multilaterals and the financing that is used by the multilateral agencies. Why we are interested in multilateral agencies in particular, because they have they are using significant funds from that are specifically targeting economic development and welfare of developing countries, what we call the official development assistance. And it is important for us to explore whether these funds are used in a way that they deliver for gender equality commitments. On this topic today, we have a very interesting panel of speakers. Sibyl Seska is joining us from OECD Online. She will set the scene on trends in the financing for gender equality. We have here Nicole Farnsworth from the Kosovo Women's Network, which is a member of Gender Budget Watchdog Network, who will present the key findings and recommendations from our working paper on the use of gender equality markers and different tools to track financing for gender equality in OECD, UN agencies, and the World Bank and the EU. Later on, we will be joined by Ludmila Malchochi. She's coming from Keystone, Moldova, and again, Gender Budget Watchdog Network member. And she will present an example that showcases the intersection of gender and disability. After that, we will be joined by UN Women advisor, senior advisor, Manjurul Kabir, who will discuss the importance of considering intersecting identities, such as persons with disabilities in development finance. At the very end, online, we will welcome Christina Stuma from the Austrian Development Agency. She has since 2011 been advisor to the Federal Ministry of European and International Affairs of Austria We also have some discussants in the room that we want to greet. Mary Collins from the European Women's Lobby and Sama Krisha from the UK Women's Budget Group. I might have mistaken this name. Okay, so let's start. I think at the beginning, it will be great to hear from Sibyl Seska. She's a policy analyst on gender equality and women's empowerment at OECD. She worked on the OECD DAC policy network on gender equality to better track aid investments and analyze finance for gender equality in development assistance, and also coordinates the work on the interlinkages between gender equality and environment in development cooperation. Sibyl was part of a team that produced a snapshot overview of the official development assistance for governance and gender equality in the last 10 years. And I think is the person that can set the scene in terms of how we are tracking finances for gender equality in the development world. Sibyl, welcome.
Great. Thank you very much, and good morning, colleagues, and thank you again for this invitation to participate and to speak at this event about gender responsive budgeting. My name is Sibyl Seska, and I work at the OECD in the Gender Equality team of the Development Cooperation Directorate. Before I start with my slides, I just wanted to provide some context about the OECD and why I'm here. In the OECD, we have the largest and the most complete database on official development assistance. So we have a very good idea of who is providing how much, for what purpose, through which channels, to which countries. And other than this data, we also have data thanks to a tool that is called the Gender Equality Policy Marker that Maria mentioned, and I think many of you have heard about. This Gender Equality Policy Marker helps us and allows us to know how much of all this development finance actually includes gender equality considerations and objectives. And using this tool is mandatory for the members of the OECD Development Assistance Committee, what we call the DAC. But it's also used beyond the DAC. There are more than 40 foundations that report and use this tool. There are several multilateral organizations that also use this gender marker tool. And so I will use this information to set the scene in terms of trends in financing for gender equality. And I chose 4 charts that we will be projecting. And I think these are the most interesting charts to set the frame for our discussion today. So the first chart, which I don't see, I hope colleagues can see.
Yes, yes, I'm putting it up. Yep.
Okay, great.
You can see. Yes, you can. Just one moment. It's up.
Great, you can go to the next one already. So the next slide shows the chart that it's a chart that we use very often, and you may have seen it already. It's coming up in the next slide. Yes, that one. This chart here shows the evolution over time of finance for gender equality from the OECD Development Assistance Committee members, and the extent to which they have integrated gender equality in their official development assistance, what we call ODA. And here I want to draw your attention to the good news and the bad news. So the good news that we can see in this chart, the good news are in the bars. You can clearly see that there is an evolution, there's growth in the bars. And these bars, they show the volume, the amount of ODA that includes gender equality objectives, either as the main objective. So in purple, you see when gender equality is the principal objective of a program. And in orange, you see where gender equality is a significant, but not the main objective of the program, but it's already a significant objective. So the sum of these bars has grown over time. And this means that the members of the OECD DAC have increased the amount of their ODA that is gender sensitive, that is gender responsive. So these are the good news. The bad news we can see that in the blue line. So the blue line there shows the share, so the percentage of the total ODA that includes gender equality objectives. And this is this share is quite an important measure because it shows the intention of the donors. It shows the efforts to integrate gender equality objectives in more and more of their ODA. And we can see that this share was growing over the decade. It was quite low in 2011-12, and it has grown quite steadily over the decade. And now, for the first time, this share has dropped. And we are looking at the detailed data to understand what may be driving this drop, but it is certainly concerning. It is alarming to see a drop in finance, for a drop in the share of finance that includes gender equality objective when we're facing a pushback against the rights of women and girls and LGBTQI plus people, and when we have crises where our responses don't seem to take the needs of women and girls properly into account. So this is what I wanted to share in this trends slide. In the next slide, we see the individual performance of the different members of the OECD Development Assistance Committee. People appreciate the slide very much because you can see the efforts that the different members are doing. For the ones more on the right, like the Netherlands, Ireland, Canada, these members seem to integrate, to mainstream very well gender equality in their ODA with shares above 80%. While on the left side, there are clearly many missed opportunities of integrating gender equality in their ODA. I don't want to spend too much time here, but I just wanted to show how this is an important accountability tool, and we update this every year based on thanks to the data that we have. So the next slide, it's the chart. So here, just to give you some context, as I said, we have a wealth of data. We can look at many different elements of this data, and we can see how much of gender equality is integrated in ODA, also in different sectors. So this is a picture of gender equality integration in ODA for the governance sector. We can look at energy, we can look at education, health, but I chose the governance here because I think is the most relevant for our discussion. And here you can see on the left, again, the governance subsectors where gender equality is not well integrated. So we can see, for example, the first one there on the left, public procurement, is just above 10%. So this means that donors integrate gender equality objectives in only 10% or a bit more of their ODA for public procurement systems. And I wanted to also draw your attention to the last orange bar there, public financial management, which is where we find support to strengthen budget systems. And here again, we see that the integration of gender equality objectives in ODA for public financial management systems is lower than the average of 43%. So there are certainly opportunities to increase support for gender responsive budgeting in partner countries. I wanted to move on to my last chart, which is to share a bit of a challenge that we have in terms of data. So all the images that I showed until now, they are about official development assistance, bilateral official development assistance from the OECD DAC members. But this is only one slice of a bigger pie, right? We're talking about development finance for gender equality. The bilateral ODA, which we see there on the left, is one slice of that pie. And it is the slice that we know best, that we know more, because we have full reporting and full details on this. So in there on the left, bilateral development finance, the purple and the orange is where it's integrated, where gender equality is integrated. The light yellow is where gender equality is not integrated, and this is what we're working with members to do. And the gray is where we don't know. So there's little we don't know. We know about a lot, and members have been working to improve this light yellow and to increase the orange and the purple part. So this is what we want to see. On the right, you see philanthropy. So philanthropy, it's another slice of the pie of finance. And we also know pretty well about, we know we have over 40 of the largest private philanthropic foundations reporting to the OECD and to the marker. So we know pretty well to what extent they integrate gender equality, although it's not very much. So the light yellow, they can still improve, integrate gender equality much more in their funding. The one in the middle is is a very big and important slice of the pie, and I think is what we'll be talking about today. And about that slice, we don't have a lot of information. The gray part there shows the amount of finance that we don't know to what extent it includes gender equality objectives. There are other slices that I'm not showing here in the chart. There's private finance, there are other, but I just wanted to draw the attention to what we know and what we don't know, and to say that we're working on this. We're working to get a complete picture of finance, and we'll have a report coming out later in this year where we want to look at this bigger picture. So stay tuned for that. And I just want to conclude with my last slide to talk very briefly about what we do in the OECD to help increase gender mainstreaming in development assistance. So one thing we do is we have recommendations on how to integrate gender equality in the design and the implementation and the financing and the monitoring of projects. And this is all in this guidance that you see on the left. That's a very comprehensive guide that includes recommendations, checklists of how members can integrate gender equality throughout the policy cycle, the program cycle. Another thing we do in the OECD is recommendations and standards. Our recommendations, they set the standard and they are agreed by all members of the Development Assistance Committee. They commit to implementing these and they are evaluated against these standards. And one that we have is the recommendation on ending sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment in development cooperation. So this, and there are several others in the OECD. We also do thematic analysis. So using this data, we see how, for example, here gender and environment intersect and how much finance goes for this intersection. And we also have other thematic analysis. And finally, I just want to mention that the OECD, together with UNDP and UN Women, we are the official custodians of the SDG indicator 5C1 on gender budgeting, and we track progress through the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation monitoring exercise on whether countries have systems in place to track and to make public their budget allocations for gender equality. And yeah, so I think I'm over my time already, so I think I'll stop here and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sibyl. It was very interesting and very up to the point, briefing, I would say, data you have shown us. Especially, I'm worried about the integration of gender equality into the public procurement, knowing that public procurement has the biggest power of transformation, considering that in developing countries is 40% of the GDP. According to your data at OECD. And I think your note on the unknown multilateral development finance use in terms of gender equality sets very well the stage of the discussion that our Nicole Farnsworth was planning to have. Nicole is the lead researcher and program manager at KWN. She, together with few other colleagues in our network, has assessed the gender equality markers used by OECD, UN agency, World Bank, and the EU as main tools that these multilateral bodies use to track gender equality financing. Dear Nicole, what are the weaknesses that we have discovered and what are the Gender Budget Watchdog Network's recommendations on improvement?
Thank you. I would start with just a bit of an introduction to this methodology. It does get a bit technical, but we thought it was important to illuminate the issues and delve into the details. So as it was mentioned, gender responsive budgeting has so far focused a lot on governments, what governments can do. But it's also applicable to any budget cycle, and multilateral funders like the UNDP, European Union, World Bank, they're among the largest multilateral funders globally. They all have made policy commitments towards gender equality that, of course, require financial support. They have gender equality strategies, they have commitments towards the percentage of resources that will be gender marker 1 and gender marker 2. And so we thought, let's take a look at these 3 multilaterals as an example, first to see how they are doing in meeting their policy commitments to furthering gender equality, but also in the context of how they may set an example for governments on gender responsive budgeting and how they could require gender responsive budgeting as obligatory as part of the financing that they are providing in development contexts. So our research question was, to what extent have multilaterals implemented gender responsive budgeting in their external development spending? Our objective was to identify recommendations for improving gender responsive budgeting in development cooperation financing, including potential improvements to systems and tools that are used by multilaterals for planning, monitoring, and evaluating expenditures and impacts towards gender equality. So our methodology involved looking at these three large multilateral funders, and the frameworks that we have used are the PEFA Gender Framework and the SDG Indicator 5C1, which I will go briefly through in a moment. We relied primarily on publicly available data sources, as well as some follow-up conversations and emails with each of the institutions. We've used the traffic light methodology because it's simple. Of course, you could say there could be a lot of variation in the middle, but we try to go into that in the paper itself. So red means they have not implemented it, yellow means it is somewhat implemented, and green means that it's fully implemented. So with the limitations, there are some, of course, with these frameworks, though it is our feeling that these are the most generally and widely accepted frameworks, which is why we have chosen to use them. Just to be clear, we do not look at countries. We're only looking at the multilaterals themselves, these three. And of course, we don't look at capacities, which we believe is a very crucial component, is the capacities within multilaterals to implement these commitments. That and the broader enabling environment, such as the systematic changes that need to happen globally to financing, are issues that we don't treat through this paper. It is still a working paper, and it will be published later this year with inputs from this discussion and from others through an online event. So just to briefly explain the indicators, one is the Public Expenditure and Financial Accountability Framework, or PEFA, which was created by the European Commission and World Bank among several governments. So that's why we thought it sensible to use the tool to see how they are implementing it themselves. It includes 9 different indicators in the gender framework that we look at that have been adjusted slightly to be applicable to multilaterals instead of only governments. And the second framework we work on that has also been mentioned today is the SDG 5C1 indicator, which has a set of specific dimensions that we look at. And I will go through each of these one by one. So first, I will go through the PEFA gender framework. The first indicator is that gender impact analyses are done of budget proposals. So we found that all multilaterals require there to be a gender analysis done during the project planning phase. However, it is not always actually done, and the quality is sometimes questionable. So one of our recommendations is to require that gender impact assessments are part of the templates and data management systems for all actions, and that these are checked. A second indicator is the gender responsive public investment management. We found that this is somewhat done in terms of investments undergoing gender analysis, but others are not. And here again, guidance, training, and mentoring could support this. A third indicator was the gender responsive budget guidance. Somewhat that this exists in terms of general guidance on gender marking, but there is not clear guidance on gender responsive budgeting being used by the multilaterals. Here we think there could be specific checklists, guidelines, and templates established that would support gender responsive budgeting in corporate data management systems. The fourth indicator is gender responsive budget proposal documentation. None of the multilaterals we looked at had this information publicly available in terms of explaining how budgets will contribute to gender equality. UNDP did sometimes link outputs to budgets in logical frameworks, but this wasn't published in a holistic way that could be seen online across different actions and at larger outcome or impact levels. Fifth one is sex disaggregated data and performance information for service delivery. Somewhat, again, this sex disaggregated data is required in reporting, but again, it's not always implemented. The new EU data management system, OPSIS, maybe some of you have heard about it. It's an online system for managing data that now all implementers will need to encode their results. And by requiring the encoding of sex disaggregated data, OPSIS holds a lot of opportunities to linking this with budgeting and expenditures in the future. But still more needs to be done to make this data required and publicly accessible in terms of the results achieved. A sixth indicator is tracking budget expenditure for gender equality. Again, we found this was somewhat done. There are the gender markers that each of the different multilaterals use for tracking. However, and I will come back to this on the OECD, there are some challenges because this generally tracks the financing, but it does not precisely track expenditures on gender equality, particularly gender marker 1, which is often categorized holistically as all the financing is going towards that, where in fact maybe only a proportion of it is. So the gender marker used by the OECD with the EU is not so exacting, let us say, in trying to track the expenditures towards gender equality, especially at an output level. The seventh indicator is on gender responsive reporting. It is somewhat carried out. It's not obligatory for all of the actions, but expenditures are not clearly tied to the results in the reports. They could be required, however, to be better tied, especially with the logical framework approach. The eighth indicator is the evaluation of gender impacts of service delivery. Again, somewhat, but it's not systematically evaluated across all of the actions and could be an evaluation criteria, which I will come back to. The ninth is the scrutiny of gender impacts on budgets. We did not find that there was any regular independent scrutiny of gender impacts of budget expenditures. UNDP has had some specific evaluations, as has the World Bank, but they are not required across evaluations in terms of scrutiny of the impacts of expenditures. And now I will turn to the SDG 5C1. You will see some of the indicators are a bit redundant, but some are not. So we thought it was important and useful to use both of the frameworks. Under the first criteria, which is intent to address gender equality by identifying policies, programs, and resources and budgets. The first indicator is programs or policies to address gender equality. Yes, all three multilaterals do have policies and strategies in place. These could be strengthened by setting targets, including targets for financing planned to contribute to the impacts. Second, the programs and policies have sufficient financing. This is a bit challenging, as we were also discussing yesterday with UNDP. How do you define sufficient? How can you actually measure sufficient? And that's an issue with the 5C1 indicator itself. But in order to measure sufficient, you would have to have a target. You would have to see what is going to be spent. And that is a problem across all of the multilaterals we looked at. We don't have in the initial strategy, what is the target? So therefore, how can we see if it was sufficient or not? And this is one challenge in terms of measuring the sufficiency of allocations for gender impacts. The third is procedures to ensure that these resources are implemented on a budget. Again, there's some requirements for reporting, but they are not always clearly tied to link how the expenditures have contributed to impact. The second criteria on 5C1 is mechanisms to track allocations of resources towards policy goals. There is no gender budget statement published, and this is a recommendation we have for all of the multilaterals and also bilaterals for that matter, to at the country level and at the international level, consider publishing an annual budget statement that explains what resources are being allocated or have been spent towards gender equality impacts. The second is gender disaggregated statistics. I've mentioned this a bit before. It is not clearly required across all of the reporting. Gender performance indicators, somewhat, again, there are indicators for progress on gender equality, but they are not always linked to the budgets. So this makes it hard in terms of seeing how budget is contributing to impact, because the two are not linked with each other, which could provide for a lot of learning. In fact, if we knew what types of expenditures are contributing to what types of impacts. And then to come back to the point on gender responsive audits do not regularly include gender responsive budgeting information. There have been some thematic audits only on gender, but it's not that gender is in all audits. So this could also be included as a requirement as part of global audits, as well as specific audits to look at gender responsiveness of the expenditures. And the last criteria, the third one, is mechanisms to make resource allocations publicly available to increase accountability to women. Accessible information on gender equality allocations is somewhat accessible, mostly for actions that are focused on gender equality. A lot less information is available online for gender mainstreamed projects and the amount allocated. I think the slide from the OECD was very telling on how much we don't know about gender mainstreamed projects from multilateral financing and development work. And timely information on gender equality allocations. The data usually is made available within a year, that data that does exist, but not all the information is provided. And here we think there are opportunities to actually provide real-time data. And we noted the example of UNDP here that makes available on its online portal expenditures towards gender equality in different areas. This could further be improved by tying it to outcomes and impacts. So we could really see visually how expenditures are contributing to particular impacts, and we could learn from that. And the last is on information on gender equality distributed to the public in an easily understandable format. Again, this kind of ties with what I was saying. How could we better visualize this to people so they see this financing does lead to these kind of impacts? And at a global level, we could learn what actually works and invest more in that. Just one last slide here on the OECD gender marker, which has been kind of an ongoing conversation even before this research that kind of has carried over, especially with the European Union, which uses the gender marker in its work. We have seen from our experience working with the EU that having 3 gender markers is sometimes difficult to measure because people have troubles with the output level and seeing how outputs contribute to gender equality, and thus they're tracking those resources. And we've noted UNDP has the interesting solution that they have actually 4 gender markers along with the UN system that allows for better tracking financing at an output level, thereby showing better actually the expenditures on gender equality, though we don't know that there's anything that could be done because we know the OECD system is what it is in terms of the 3 markers, but it is something we've thought about. Could it be discussed to have 4 markers and how that might help with the reporting on financing? It could perhaps be something discussed later. And then there's also the issue of capacity that we talked earlier. The marking is optional, thus it's often not marked. And if it were required, maybe we would have more data in terms of marking. But that would also require quality control by experts. And we've seen a lot of mismarking in our monitoring and analysis. So seeing how we could work in quality control in the marking process to have more accurate measurement of expenditures. And then the last topic, which will kind of segue into my colleague Ludmila, that we've been thinking about, we always have thought about, is intersectionality, and not just women as a holistic category, but women with disabilities, minority women, rural women. How do we measure financing for all of them in a way that makes sense, but does not create too much administrative burden? And this is a challenge we're looking at now, how we could come into other templates or ways of suggesting how to measure this in the future. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicole. A lot of yellow and a lot of recommendations on how to actually go to the green area. I think that we now contributed to more understanding why the gray area of the OECD slide where we didn't know where the multilateral financing is going and whether it's contributing to gender equality is, and how through using this tool of gender responsive budgeting, we can contribute to better understanding the contribution of the multilateral external financing to deliver better for gender equality commitments. Lyudmila is again representing a Gender Budget Watchdog Network member. She is the Executive Director of Keystone Moldova, and we are very grateful for Keystone to be part of our network because they bring this perspective of disability into all of our work, and I hope that she can now turn our attention to the implications that strengthened inclusive budgets can have on national levels, on inclusive education and other areas of work.
Thank you very much, Maria, and dear ladies and gentlemen. I will continue like the presentation that have been started by Nicole. Practically, our case study is focused on analysis of intersectionality of gender and disability inclusiveness in World Bank, UN Agency, and European Commissions, and will come with some recommendations for improving this intersectionality in the end. First of all, I would like to focus on the World Bank. If we can have a slide. Practically, our findings show that the main objectives of the Disability Inclusion and Accountability Framework that was approved by the World Bank in 2022 is to support the mainstreaming of disability in World Bank activities and investments. And the framework lays out a roadmap for including disability in the World Bank policies, oriented operations, and analytical work, and building internal capacities for supporting clients in implementing disability inclusive development programs. Also, disability inclusive projects should be aligned with the World Bank Group gender strategies to achieve greater gender equality for SDG 5. The analysis of the online data of project by theme shows that gender subcategory is included under the human development and gender, and disability subcategory is included under social development and protection. Meantime, in both cases, there is no data on how disability projects contribute to gender equality and on how gender equality provide and contribute to disability equality.
Could we ask just a bit slower? And
Okay.
your mic's on, right? Just for the online participants.
Okay.
Cool.
Sorry. The World Bank also doesn't use the gender or disability markers with multi-donor trust funds. The gender tag is used exclusively under the Umbrella Facility for Gender Equality. However, the Umbrella Facility for Gender Equality doesn't integrate disability intersectionality. There is also no information on project's impact on gender and disability inclusion. The World Bank data gender portal doesn't cover any disability indicators. Next slide, please. Now we'll focus on findings on UN agencies. The United Nations Disability Inclusion Strategies approved in 2020 provide the foundation for sustainable and transformative progress on disability inclusion through all pillars of the United Nations works. UNDP has started upgrading its Leaving No One Behind project marker by incorporating an intersectionality functions. In 2017, UN Women established an internal global task team on disability inclusion and intersectionality to strengthen UN work in these areas. In 2020, UN Women established the Disability Inclusion and Intersectionality Community of Practice to support the critical work of mainstreaming disability inclusion. The analysis of the UNDP projects on Transparency Portal and on finding windows show that UNDP provides data on projects globally by SDG, including SDG 5 on gender equality. However, there is no data on how much of project budgets are allocated specifically for gender and specifically for disability inclusion. The Sustainable Development Goals framework includes 7 targets, which explicitly refer to persons with disabilities. and 6 further targets on persons and in vulnerable situations, which include persons with disabilities. While the SDGs include persons with disabilities, this does not fully extend into the monitoring framework. Progress on SDG gender snapshot for 2023 do not integrate indicators related to men and women with disabilities. Next slide, please. European Commission. European Commission is committed to address the intersectionality of gender and disability through all policy documents related to gender and disability inclusion. The European Commission adopted the use of both OECD dark disability policy marker and gender marker screening almost 100% of the applicable OEDA projects. The EDF monitored the use of disability marker by the EU and found that in 2021, almost 3/4 of applicable OEDA projects were not reported to be disability inclusive in any significant way. Furthermore, the European Commission reported that only 2% of all applicable OEDA projects in 2021 had disability inclusion as the principal objectives. Gender and disability intersectional as approaches in European Union Commissions are also low. Out of the total of 853 European Commission OEDA projects covered by analysis of NGOs for 2021, only 633 were reported to have objectives on gender equality. Of these, only 35% also had objectives on disability inclusion. Next slide, please. The NGOs organization found also some limitations for using disability and gender markers for the estimation of expenditures dedicated to those aspects. First of all, markers are qualitative and show the allocations before projects started. Secondly, there is no very clear distribution of expenditures in function of gender and disabilities. And third, while the gender marker is mandatory, the disability marker is not mandatory. That means online data can be incomplete. Next one slide, and the last one. Based on our analysis and this case study, we come with the following recommendations for development partners. First of all, we think that it is very important to integrate in SDG monitoring process, especially those related to gender equality, the indicator related to disability equity, and to monitor them on a constant basis across the countries. Secondly, it is very important to make the disability market obligatory for all development projects. Also, it is very important to link disability and gender markers to allocation and expenditures to be easy to understand how much budget is dedicated to disability and to gender. It is very important to increase the transparency of the development project by disclosure publicly the gender and disability markers because not in all projects of international development agents we can have, this publicly disclosed. As well, it is very important to have the disclosure of all allocations and expenditures. And in the end, but not the last, it is very important to integrate the impact assessments on women and persons with disabilities in all developed project, gender and disability markets. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vila. It's very telling that we have these markers. Some of them are compulsory, the others are not. Improving the markers would need to probably make a synergy between the two in order to see the inclusivity of the gender equality interventions that are financed through multilateral financing. And I hope that we can hear more about that in the speech of Dr. Munjuru Kabir from UN Women. But before that, I would like to give the floor to the Christina Stume from the Austrian Development Agency. It's very difficult as we know, to track financing for gender equality. The Austrian Development Agency is one of the bright case studies, a very good example to be followed, and that's why we were very happy that Christina accepted our invitation to present the Austrian Development Agency way of mainstreaming gender in their development financing, but also on the follow-up mechanisms that they use to check compliance with commitments. Christina, the floor is yours.
Hello to everybody from Austria, and thank you, Maria, for the invitation and opportunity to contribute to this side event from a bilateral perspective. And I really enjoyed the interesting input so far, from which we can also learn, of course. Before I dive deep on our approach to gender marking as a strategic and steering tool, so to say, in development cooperation, I would like to mention that ADC has promoted gender-responsive budgeting per se in our partner countries already before the official introduction of GRB as an approach to be used in Austria's budgeting process at the national level. So ADC has supported strategic programs in our partner countries and has actively engaged in policy dialogue since 2005 already, and we've supported, for example, UN Women in the Western Balkan region for more than 10 years, and have learned from this long cooperation that a continuous support to build the institutional environment, meaning policies, mechanisms, and capacities, is one essential requirement for gender-responsive budgeting to become institutionalized. And we have supported research cooperation such as with the Makerere University in Uganda and the Vienna University of Business and Economics, and various civil society initiatives to promote advocacy for GRB with partner country governments. And this includes the cooperation on the Gender Budget Watchdog program with Maria as a lead coordinator, which is an important partnership I'm glad to mention. So lastly, I would like to mention also an initiative of the Learn for Deaf gender group in 2014, in which Austria has been an active member. And I mention it because the Learn for Deaf group contributed to a PEFA survey by submitting concrete suggestions on how to reward PFM systems for providing better gender-aware information. And the suggested changes, I remember, also concerned the indicators. And I'm mentioning this because at that time, I remember that PEFA indicators were considered to have to be neutral. And in fact, that meant gender blind, and there was no gender framework. So we have we've seen some progress in this regard, at least in the last 10 years. And they are very useful and obviously being monitored, as we have heard. So to come back to Austria's national efforts to improve the gender relevance of its finance, I would now like to go back to 2013, where Austria has introduced gender budgeting as part of a broader package of performance budgeting reforms. And since then, the application of GRB has become a constitutional requirement, which makes Austria relatively, if not unique, among OECD countries, with its gender equality provisions at the constitutional level being specific on the practice of gender-responsive budgeting. So how does this work in practice? Again, very briefly, each ministry has to define a maximum of 5 outcomes per budget chapter. These outcomes are part of the annual budget decision in Parliament, and at least one of the outcomes per budget chapter has to be a gender outcome. And they have also concrete measures, as outputs have to be defined by each ministry to support the respective outcomes, including gender outcomes and also appropriate indicators. And the Court of Audit assesses whether outcomes and outputs are met. So what does this mean for Austria's development cooperation? After introduction of GRB as a principle of the performance-based budgeting, the Austrian MFA has defined an impact goal specifically for its development cooperation, Impact Goal 3, which aims at sustainably reducing global poverty, strengthening peace and humanitarian security, and preserving the environment in partner countries as part of bilateral and multilateral development cooperation. Gender equality and the needs of children and people with disabilities remain a priority. So in order to make this priority measurable, it was agreed to use the OECD Gender Policy Marker System as a methodology to track the progress. And just in brief to explain, and I think it has been measured, the marker system helps to assess whether an intervention at the design stage contributes through one or more components significantly to gender equality. This would be translated in a gender marker 1, or if the contribution to gender equality is the main purpose of the intervention, this being translated in a gender marker 2. And gender marker 0 is allocated if the program does not provide any indication to analyze and tackle gender equalities as integral part of the intervention. So What is important also is that the OECD policy marker on gender comes along with a set of clearly defined criteria, such as the requirement for gender analysis to inform the design of an intervention. It has been also mentioned already, the requirement to define at least one target to contribute to gender equality in the log frame or whatever results matrix is being used, as well as to collect sex disaggregated data as a basis and to monitor the intervention, also allowing for steering measures. So for us to measure the impact goal, it was necessary to define a gender-specific target, and this is where the EU Gender Action Plan 2 came in, because a target for EU donors was promoted at that time that 75% of project volume of an EU donor's bilateral aid should comply with either OECD Gender Marker 1 or 2. So for Austria, it took 2 steps to have this percentage officially being integrated as a guiding target. Firstly, we managed to have this target being referred to as a commitment in our gender policy. This was important, but it only became really binding when this indicator was adopted as one of a few official targets to measure this impact goal for development cooperation. And this indicator is now formulated as share of the financial volume with OECD Gender Equality Policy Marker 1 or 2 in ADC core budget, and the target, and this meant this kind of institutionalization meant a big progress from a gender perspective and a more strategic approach. And also this is being monitored by the Parliament. So going back to today, just to confirm that the impact goal is still the same, and the gender target has increased from, I think it was 70% when the target was introduced around 2015, and today we have 85% for 2024, in line also with the target as defined in the new EU Gender Action Plan 3. And the recent actual figures on this target are available from 2022. Where 93% of the total volume of ADC development finance has been marked either with gender marker 1 or 2 as an all-time high. And just if you saw the slide Sibylle has presented, Austria was much lower. This is because what I'm now describing is the system, the MFA, as one of the many ODA actors in Austria is being using. So others don't do this, and therefore the average is lower. So maybe also important to mention that the progress on the target is now to be reported on a quarterly basis to the Parliament, and that ADA has translated the criteria for the gender policy marker into minimum standards for working with our partners. So, and as soon as the new ADC gender policy will be adopted, there will be also a need to provide explicit explanation by partners and ADA program managers if an intervention does not comply with a gender marker 1 or the respective and the respective criteria going along with this. So with regard to humanitarian aid, ADC has also committed to meet the 15% target of all humanitarian programming to be gender responsive. Here I have to mention that we lack a clear definition of what gender responsive means in the context of humanitarian aid. It's a different context, and I really want to make the point that it would be helpful to have a more deliberate attempt of the international community, bilateral donors and multilaterals to agree on quality criteria for humanitarian aid to be gender responsive, because we still face a lot of challenges in this regard. And the humanitarian context is still different than a development context, despite all efforts within the HDP nexus. So briefly and finally on the challenges we have faced, not surprisingly, the ambitious goals and the clear criteria introduced have in some cases led to gender washing. Also, it is often challenging to ensure that the criteria are met with certain partners, which includes all different kind of partners, such as Austrian civil society partners, as well as local ones, especially when we contribute to sector financing in partner countries. It's challenging, to see this criteria really being taken serious, especially when it comes to good gender analysis as a basis for integrating gender into the interventions. And a very big challenge also is the resources being necessary to monitor the quality, to ensure this quality, and to support partners to develop in this regard. And we have increased financial and personnel resources, being required, but not having received this additional resources. So it's a big challenge where to focus on. So, and lastly, defining a gender goal in terms of financial means being provided is insofar challenging as it of course does focus, as it has been mentioned, on the input side only, and it doesn't look at the outputs and impact, because we assess and count the markers at the design stage. To conclude, I think I can say that having and using the gender marker as a tool to guide and measure gender equality in development cooperation in combination with national gender responsive budgeting provisions and also the monitoring of the parliament helped a lot to increase as well awareness and capacity, but also quality of programs in the context of gender equality promotion. And it definitely led to an increase of funds being invested in gender equality in the Austrian Development Cooperation. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm open for any questions afterwards.
Thank you very much, Christina. It was great to hear how by setting policy and relevant measures, you can achieve the goal to which you have committed as a state, but as part of the European Union as well. And I am very much grateful of your frank assessment of the challenges and the opportunities to improve, which shows that actually this applying gender responsive budgeting can provide a successful evolution of how public finance is used in order to promote equality in the development of the developing countries. Last but not least, we have Dr. Manjurul Kabir here in our room, and he's the Senior Global Advisor and Team Leader on Gender Equality and Disability Inclusion at UN Women. His background is in human rights. He's a political scientist with experience with rule of law, governance, and human rights. Dr. Kabir, as UN Women, is overseeing gender mainstreaming across the UN system. I would like you to reflect on how financing for gender equality and disability can improve effectiveness of the development assistance.
Sure. Right. Thank you very much. You can hear me, right?
Yes.
Online also. And I'm very grateful that you have extended the invitation to us. It's a busy time, but I was also curious looking at some of your country-based work, especially in the region where I worked before. So that also resonated a lot of reflection. And I think the presentation so far was very, very nice in the sense that very informative. Our colleagues from OECD and also Austrian government did uncover a number of areas which I would not repeat, and particularly shedding light on gender mainstreaming, gender marker, and the way forward. And every year when we had this CSW, this is a 68th session, right? And almost 12 or more since the creation of UN Women in 2010. One of the recurring challenges, of course, that there you can see the whole combination of work demonstrated also at the high-level political forum that happens later part of the year. But the big challenge remains, of course, the implementation. There is considerable implementation gap elsewhere. I had a few, I have a few written comments, but after hearing some of your contribution, I decided to go more off script and respond some of the questions that have been discussed here. And let me just address, not in any order of sort of priority. We spoke about impact, but the challenges for assessing impact is it's also linked to how the decline in the ODA globally. So if you talk about any multilateral agency, whether it is UNDP, UN Women, or any UN system organization, contributes to certain sectoral investment, they're not the only one who is contributing to that sector. So attribution becomes extremely challenging and difficult. If you contribute to, if you realize, we realize that globally everyone during the pandemic year 2020, 2021 when many organizations sort of contributed to health sector, suddenly we realized gaps in health sector in terms of accessibility, in terms of quality of the health. I'm not talking about only vaccination, but that unfolds and opens up a lot of gaps, and reaching out to women, persons with disabilities, different groups, people living in remote places, in rural areas. And those are important for gender equality as well, because unless you reach out, and we talk about also in linking with SDGs principle of leaving no one behind, but then everyone defines leaving no one behind differently. If you hear the presentation in June, high-level political forum, member states, countries are presenting their success cases. Every country is prioritized different groups, different regions, and look at it from a different perspective. So having a consistent narrative across all countries becomes extremely challenging. And that has a resonance in the impact assessment. When you do the impact assessment and see that, okay, we invested in this sector, what is the impact in terms of from a gender perspective? Now, we are not the only system that contributes to the sector, and countries are also graduating from different status, from lower middle income, from middle income, from upper middle income. And as they're graduating and funding their own projects, our leverage, for good reasons, are now becoming extremely limited. So are we really counting all type of funding, whether coming from national sources, international sources? International sources is extremely limited. And many countries are no longer dependent on aid, which is extremely well-deserved progress, because that is the outcome we all want. And while that is a desired outcome, whether we have the capability or initiative to also assess those type of funding that is happening. Currently, we are not necessarily assessing all type of funding. So therefore, attribution and claiming that this is resulting or because of our contribution, I would very humbly suggest that that would be challenging moving on. And that may not be factual. You might just raise the example of few pilots where maybe your project contributing to the entire pilot budget, but that is the moment you scale up, it becomes more challenging. So that's one thing I think we are grappling with, and I think we will be grappling with more and more as the SDG reached its midpoint and people are looking beyond 2030 as well. Secretary is talking about Summit of the Future. But then, of course, you have all these issues will have to be addressed at the same time. Then we mentioned about, of course, the intersectional approach in this, because we are talking about, look, gender responsive budgeting and all these tools we mentioned are very, very good, and it gives us a lot of food for thought. But what about the other sectors, right? And our colleagues who presented the case study on disability is a good example. But if you then we are talking about LGBTQ, we are talking about indigenous population, we are talking about rural women, where they are sometimes totally outside the focus. We are talking about how economic empowerment can benefit rural women, but that is not happening consistently. Where there are big challenges of care agenda. How do you really assess and ensure that caregiving role has been economically sort of assessed to the way we all want, and whether there is a voluntary caregiving or there's a forced caregiving when a mother taking care of a person with disability, her child, what is the value of that caregiving? Do we have any tool at our disposal? What is the role of the community? What is the role of the states? I'm raising these issues not because I want to make everyone's life difficult in this space, but these are the issues that we are now grappling with, because the success case are easier to project, but these issues are important to raise so that we don't forget that we are actually working on a set of data and which are at our disposal, but there are many other challenging lack of data and areas where we haven't reached enough to the extent that we should have been by this time. I'll give one example. We have regular interaction with Interparliamentary Union, because women in parliament is a critical area for women's political participation, right? So if you look at the IPU's map, where IPU draw the map in terms of which parliaments of the world have how many women parliamentarian. Now, of course, the map has been progressively getting better and better. And in terms of your traffic light, there are much more green perhaps in many parliaments, but there are many parliaments which have totally male dominated and few number of women of parliament. But when I looked at, as a political scientist, some of the parliament were a lot more women than before because of the quota, because of the special arrangement and provision and special sort of electoral arrangement as well. We also realized the challenges, and IPU did acknowledge that in our conversation with them, where women were elected in parliament, but not necessarily they are in the position of power inside parliament, right? So you have standing committee where women are typically nominated and not necessarily powerful standing committee. We have women sitting in the powerful standing committee, but not necessarily playing the leadership role. So women are used much more as a number than actually really changing the policy, shaping the parliamentary environment. And that is a big challenge. If you look at whether the OECD countries' parliament or developing countries' parliament, situation is not necessarily better in any places, where many parliaments, including the country we are sitting in now, if you look at the women in Congress and women in Senate, situation is really not something you can take pride in. And so there are many, many countries where status of women inside parliament. And one of the reasons is we looked at parliament and we tried to improve parliament through quota and constitutional amendment, but we didn't look at the political party reform issue in the context of gender, right? So as a result, the way a political party nominated women candidate or men candidate has fundamentally flawed, and that resulted into you have this specific provision which increased the number but didn't increase the influence or didn't increase to some extent quality. Of course, many would say that that is a male argument of that women are not as qualified as some of the seasoned male parliamentarians. But you have to give that opportunity to play that powerful role and policy making. And that opportunity is extremely limited for women in many places. And then talk about other sector. Women with disability inside parliament is extremely rare. And if you look at other categories of leaving no one behind, you don't. I'm just using parliament as a metaphor, but you can use this in any sector and you realize the challenges is severe. I am also mindful of that. I have 3 more minutes, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, there are, of course, some of the good practices that are emanating, as all colleagues are mentioned. And I just want to add a few recommendations as well. As I'm ending my presentation, raising some of the issues for your deliberation and food for thought. I think it is extremely important now to focus on each countries we are dealing with, whether they have an enabling framework of constitutional legal provisions, institution and policies which can be leveraged. So currently we are looking at those who are working with gender, they looked at only from a gender angle, right? Those who are disability advocates, sometimes disability movement and gender movement doesn't talk in countries. And it's very important. And there are competing interests. People are funding for same pot of funds. Sometimes there are issues of leadership. So they don't talk and have a harmonious approach. So if we have an enabling framework and all the actors are around that framework to support a policy reform, that would be much more useful than having very sectoral approach to, okay, let's look for gender, let's look for disability, let's for indigenous population separately. Because the question you have raised very rightly, that whether gender benefited disability or disability benefited gender, I would not even go to that question, because if you look at the intersectional approach, you have many other categories, right? So if you want to take a holistic approach and then try to see how each influence others, there's nothing wrong if gender does not directly benefit disability, but it's only thing that if you create a space which is enabling environment where accessibility is promoted across gender or not, then that helps all type of actors, whether someone has logical disorder, whether someone has learning disability, whether there is a physical disability. Currently, unfortunately, even if you look at the disability movement, people see disability by looking at wheelchair, unfortunately. They are only seeing disability more of a physical disability. But there are many other layers of disability which are totally invisible. And that invisibility is a kind of a metaphor for our development, that we don't see many areas, the development challenges, because they are invisible. We just want to see what is in front of us. And then wheelchair becomes a perfect example for us, the way we want to see a particular problem. And secondly, I would also sort of recommend that aligning public finance management system with gender, disability, and other intersectional areas. And I will give an example and probably finish for the interest of the time. Last year, I had an opportunity to work with in Oslo with auditors from all over the world. They have a global institution, Intosai, which is a global body for auditors. And they're trying to come up with a auditing criteria for measuring LNOB. Because auditors are in great difficulty. How do audit LNOB? Because these are more political developmental mantra. When people look at performance audit or compliance audit, they are really want to empirical evidence, data, right? In many cases, these data and empirical evidence are missing. So we try to develop a criteria, and I realized that across all regions, not only in North America, Asia Pacific, Africa, but also in MENA regions and sub-regions, auditors are talking about challenges of assessing either gender, disability, both, intersectionality, and all these categories of leaving no one behind. We did develop a category, tentative, but many auditors are raising that how do you then make sure there are data behind it? How can we hold government accountable or a public institution accountable if they do not reach LNOB? Because these are not also sometimes legally accountable to many bodies. And so there comes the challenges. Unless something is audited, your performance is reviewed, you will not be held accountable for not delivering whether your public bodies you are leading is gender responsive or not, because you are not violating any law. So how do you hold the accountability at the national level? With that, I will stop here for the interest of the time, but thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kabir. Very important notes on the impact and the challenges that come from the decline of ODA globally, and especially this aspect of including the audit and their contribution to the scrutinizing of how public finance management systems are delivering to inclusivity in one society. We have different systems of audits around the world. Those countries that have courts of auditors are more effective into following up with the recommendations of the audit office, but nevertheless, it's very important that we put them into the big picture of governance of the public finance system and how that can contribute to improved gender equality and equality that is more intersectional, not looking just on gender issues. So now I open the discussion here in the room, and we have online also one discussant that is joining us. Do you have any questions for the speakers? Do you have any interventions that you would like to share? Please. Can you?
Sorry,
Yeah.
to come up to the microphone?
Because we want to record this and have it shared. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the wonderful session, sharing all the data. Very nice. So my name is Shiva. I'm from SAPI. I'm from India. I'm also work with Women in Global Health, India chapter as a mentor. So the one small example I would like to share is, as a civil society, ADB recently engaged a lot of us in evolving or integrating some of the conditions for the government to ensure gender-related actions. But as you have rightly said, Kavi sir, that because they're not mandated to do this, or you can't change the legal framework, it's very tough. But they're trying. I just wanted to say that it's not, if you want to include the conditionalities with the loans, it's not possible. And because many times, as somebody has said, you yourself have said domestic budgets are increasing, and the countries are saying we really don't need the loans, we don't need the grants, you can take the money. I wanted to share that, but we should continue to try and move forward and share examples. The question I have is whether you have any good examples among all the speakers where one of the developing countries have done a good gender responsible budgeting or move towards these processes, if you can share and point to such a country. Thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions or reflections? Maybe? Please? Sorry.
There is a hand also.
Yeah. Oh, yes, Sama will.
Okay. Okay. So thank you very much. I'm Josu Sanchez. I work with UNDP in the gender team. So it's been like really interesting to listen to this presentation, and it's good to.
We don't seem to hear you anymore. Is that only me? Yeah. Can you speak?
Hello. Yes.
Yeah, we hear you again, but very low.
Okay. Should I start again? Or?
Yes, that's good. Yeah.
There is an echo.
Yeah. Okay, now I'm showing the laptop. No, I think now it's okay. Is it okay now?
Yes, you can hear.
Yes.
So let me start again. Joseph Sanchez, working with UNDP, with the gender team. I wanted first actually to congratulate the organizers of this session. I think it's actually great and so important that civil society does this kind of work and bring us together here, UN agencies, governments like Austria, and create this kind of space. I think it's very good, and it's great that we are kind of accountable to you, and that you can give us a feedback whether we like it or not. And that's very important, and I would like to recognize that first. I will look at the report once it's out, and we'll have follow-up discussions, so I'm not gonna get into the details. I mean, it's clear that there are many things to improve. Well, that's gonna help us a lot. I wanted maybe to reflect on a couple of additional things, and it's been so interesting to listen also to the OECD, to the Austria Development Agency, and to the colleague of women. Many lessons learned there as well. I want to mention that this chart that the OECD colleague has shared, it's kind of very worrying, and I want to kind of emphasize that as well. And from our side, we see this kind of decrease of investment on gender equality in a context where we are seeing not only the backlash, but in a context where we are seeing an increase on investment on other areas like defense and military, and this kind of trend is kind of definitely very, very worrying, and it's important to visualize, to make it visible. In terms of the gender markers, I would like to mention that where we are in UNDP as well, trying to improve it, just to mention three things. One is that for us it's very important also to strengthen the quality assurance mechanisms to ensure that the gender marking is correct, because one thing is that the figure that we have, but what is behind, this is one thing. The second part would be more related to the granularity of the monitoring of the financing for gender equality. We are kind of reflecting on how maybe we can go a little bit deeper and try to monitor the investment on gender equality, not only at the output level, but also at the activity level. That's work in progress. And finally, also trying to have a more clear link between our investments and the results on the impact. And even though we have this discussion on contribution and attribution, I think that the point is more see how we contribute to have an impact. Lastly, not to make it very long, also I wanted to say that for us, what we have learned is that while the gender marker really helps to have a clear tool that can inform decision makers and can show the commitment and investment that we are doing on gender equality, on its own, it's just a tool that has a limited impact. So what we are trying to do is to make this part of a broader system with different things, and I'm gonna just name some of the ingredients and we'll stop there. And for us, it's very important to keep investing on leadership, that leadership actually have a clear commitment on gender equality, keep investing on capacities. So we have the actual capacities in the different areas of working, investing on partnerships, investing also in our internal workplace, our culture, because we are not isolated from the world, and definitely in the UN system and within UNDP as well. Patriarchy is part of the way that we are kind of working, so we are also trying to address that internally. It's very important to see how we can walk the talk internally and see how all this together with the financing can have a better impact. So I just want to finish linking up with the very beginning part of this kind of financing trend. So it's kind of, we need to keep this kind of urgency approach and mode that we need to keep pushing to change that trend and have a better impact. So,
thank you very much. Thank you very much, especially for the support and openness to address all our questions in the research phase and reflect upon the recommendations in this phase. I think that it's very important that the Gender Budget Watchdog Network is recognized and heard, but also that we learn from each other and cooperate. Because we have the same objectives to improve this way of how development finance is used, and that contributes to greater gender equality. Sama is online. She's coming from the Women's Budget Group in the UK, someone that we look up to because they do quite important research and advocacy work. And we join forces on global levels, as we do with the European Women's Lobby. In the room here, we have Mary Collins, the new Secretary General of the European Women's Lobby, that I also invite for contributions in discussions. Sama, the floor is yours.
Hi, Maria, and thank you for having me. And thank you for all the brilliant presentations. I really enjoyed them, and they were very, very insightful. And hi, Nicole. It's good to see you again and learn more about your research. I think all of what I learned today is very important, but as an organization that works a lot at a very grassroots local level in the UK, we have a project called the Local Data Project, where we try to build capacities of groups of women and women's civil society organization on how to access data sets, read them, and use them for their advocacy, I think there is a gap between what governments are required to do and what women really need, and not only women, of course, women, LGBTQ, racialized people, and all the different intersection of vulnerabilities included. I think there is a gap in the sense that we need quality data that can be interpreted and can be representative of the real needs. So we cannot use the same frameworks as a box-ticking exercise in order to say, this government is doing gender-responsive budgeting. There are a lot of governments who have adopted laws on gender-responsive budgeting since the early 2000s, but what impact do they have right now? And it's beyond the OECD member states, for example. It's more of, as a global issue, it's more complicated. And in many countries, there is no access to sex segregated data, and their national offices, for example, do not have the capacity to produce sex segregated data that can be interpreted and used later for better gender budgeting. So my question now to the people representing the different multilateral organizations present here, and Nicole, because she has a lot of knowledge about this, how do you see this gap closed, and how can we have effective consultations with civil society around this? Because, for example, the World Bank have the Civil Society Forum, the IMF, and the World Bank has a gender strategy, but to which extent what is happening on the ground is translated into policies in an effective way? So, yeah.
Thank you, Sama. We have 5 minutes to finish, so I will maybe give a very short time for Mary to reflect, and maybe for the panel to conclude. Maybe Nicole to conclude. Thank you.
Okay, good morning, I should say, everybody, and thank you so much for inviting me. I feel extremely honored. We've been working closely together for quite a while now. And I think that together we can make it happen. We believe that we can, and we will. So just a couple of things I wanted to say. I mean, I think you mentioned the word holistic. And it's true, as we kind of open Pandora's box, it gets more and more complex, and life is complex. And that's why it's important to put this. But one of the strengths that we have discovered with gender budgeting or gender responsive budgeting is you have to put everything first. So you have to revise and review everything that we are doing. Are we spending our money, public money that belongs to everybody, in a way that meets our societal obligations? We have the UN Charter of Human Rights, we have the CEDAW committee, we have a number of obligations. There are obligations the states have to do. So we must make sure that our spending is actually meeting the goals. That's as simple as that. And also to say that money is power. At the end of the day, it is about power. And it's about the distribution of power, and it's about using the power in ways that can include or exclude as well, or maintain at a distance. So one of the issues that was raised is about accessible information. I think that's key. Because when we look at all of the indicators, and if we were to trace those, they're highly technical. So the issue is, how do we demystify gender responsive budgeting? Because at the end of the day, it's actually simple. But when we start talking about the indicators and about the markers and about everything else, whoa, okay, that's where we lose the grassroots, as was pointed out earlier. Because everybody should be asking these questions. Everybody. And what's really striking as well is that we see it as a development issue, which is, at the end of the day, it's about distributing public money in a way that everybody benefits. It's not only about development. It's, and I'm talking now from within the perspective of the European Union, it's all very well saying that everybody else out there needs it, but let's have a look at ourselves. So we're fortunate to have countries like Austria, where it's mandatory, where it's in the constitution, and we have lots of lessons to learn, but we are a far cry from it. And like we talked about the different roles and the different actors, and it was in fact the European Court of Auditors that really, I would say, gave a kick to the whole system in the EU, when in 2021, 3 years ago, produced a report that said gender mainstreaming the EU budget, time for action. So it says it all. And basically looked at the funding of all of the EU funds for the last number of years, and saw that there was no gender mainstreaming, because that's what gender mainstreaming is. It's about making sure that everything, including finances and distribution of resources and budgets, actually meet gender equality goals. So they have set out, they have really put the pressure as well, and I'm very happy for it, on the European Commission, who have begun to do some markers and are now looking at some of the programs within the EU budget. And I'm not going to drag them into that budget because it's also complex, but just to say that the work has only started. So we have a lot of work to do, and we're very, very happy that we have recommendations. We're very happy that you too, as the agencies, are coming on board to listen, because obviously we need to see the whole picture. And really, at the end of the day, it comes back to leadership. Somebody said the word leadership, I think maybe it's you. We need political will. We can see that where there is political will, there is a will. And we have many examples in the framework of the European Union, where we've had the first ever woman president of the European Commission in the last 5 years. And she has put issues on the agenda that nobody else ever did. And that includes directive legislation on violence against women, a care strategy, talked about care, women on boards, which is about women's representation in public. Pay transparency, but also just to say women on boards, because it's publicly quoted companies on the stock exchange. They're making massive investment decisions. So it's really important that we have women at every single level of decision. But I think I've gone over my time, and lots of questions. So it's about how do we get the political. We have lots of recommendations. We have lots of suggestions. We've been working on this for a while. But how now can we give the political push at every level? I mean, I think the UN Secretary is very committed.
Yeah,
so
if I can give a suggestion, after the European elections, we can join forces and lobby the new European institutions and representatives in the European Parliament together with these recommendations that we came up with. So I will now just invite Nicole to respond to some of the questions, and if you want also to contribute, because we ran out of time.
Yeah, we're at the end of the time, so I will be less than 1 minute. I think we have to demystify, and I know my presentation was not demystifying, it was totally confusing. So apologies for that, it was for a very specific audience, but I agree we have to make it simple, and we have to make it known that it's about everybody, and this goes to the grassroots. And if these technocratic processes were followed, the first step is gender analysis. That's how you bring in the grassroots. The first step is going and meeting with people and seeing their needs and getting the data and finding out how we can best address the needs. That's number 1 step. So if step number 1 in all of those indicators I presented is followed, we will know the needs, and the grassroots will have participatory discussions about our tax money and how it is spent. I totally agree also about the relationships. We can't talk about developing and developed. They're interrelated. There's extraction. It's been talked a lot about at the CSW. There's reparations. There's taxes. There's multinational taxes, those huge multinational corporations that aren't being taxed. There's how can the UN and the EU address this, because that money will pay for gender equality if we just start taxing it properly. So these kind of bigger discussions are outside of our research, but definitely need to be discussed in terms of advocating for change. And the last point I would say, which maybe Maria will reinforce, is the Gender Budget Watchdog Network. We're an international network. We are working with other key actors like the European Women's Lobby and others, and we hope to continue to build this coalition to follow up on some of these recommendations together, because it's only through joint advocacy and working together with the UN system, with the EU, with the member states, that we can actually bring about these changes. So we look forward to cooperating in the upcoming processes with you.
Thank you very much, Nicole. I will close here with an invitation, everyone that is here and is online, to join our Gender Budget Watchdog Network and make it from Gender Budget Watchdog Network of Western Balkans and Moldova into a global alliance. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sibyl. It was great having you. Thank you, Christina. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye, colleagues.